Hi, I'm Miss Amber, and this is the English 12B live lesson for today. Throughout the rest of this course, what we've been doing is going through just assignments and learning about the different time periods that people live in and how that affects what people write. And this lesson is no different today. Today's lesson is the fifth tutorial in Unit 1, and it's Jane Austen. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, so starting off from slide number 5 where the lesson begins, they give you background information about Jane Austen. She was born in 1775 and she wrote from between 1790 and 1817. Now, they're telling you about this time because there was a lot going on with her at this time. The American Revolution started in 1776. And even though that was just after she was born, there were other things that happened as well. The French Revolution in 1789. And there were also the Napoleonic Wars where England fought against France. And those things happened while she was writing and publishing books. The reason why this is important is because, as I've said in some of the other lessons, time periods where people are born and live affect what they choose to write. Now, part of the reason why this is significant here is because Austen's works do not reflect on any of the battles that took place when she was born and what happened throughout her life. She lived in the countryside with the landed gentry, and that's a certain class of people. You're going to get a little more information about that in the upcoming slides. But the important thing here is that her novels deal with the day-to-day issues of these landed gentry people. They were upper and middle class families that lived off the income derived from the land that they owned. So they were able to get money because of the money that because of the money that they got. They were able to survive because of the money that they got from the land they owned. So they would rent out their land or allow other people to live on the property, and they would get money in exchange, or they would allow people to farm their land and they would get paid for their use of the land. So Austen's central characters are the women of the families because of how society was set up and depending on what the women had to deal with at the time. Really, their day-to-day lives weren't affected by all of the things happening outside of the country. They didn't have to fight. They weren't really involved in politics at the time because women were not allowed to at that time. So her books often give the impression that these women kind of existed in their own world. And that's because they're so far removed from everything else that was going on in the world at the time. If you were to read any of her books, you'd be like, oh, this happened at the same time as the American Revolution. This happened at the same time as the Napoleonic Wars. They were unaffected by that directly. Those wars weren't happening in those places. The women were not affected. So it's an interesting glimpse, like a window into what women were dealing with at that time. Okay, so this slide, number 6, tells you about the focus of the novels with a little more detail. So they let you know that the focus is on manners and polite discourse. So basically how people were expected to treat one another at that time. I will say that during this time period, women were pretty well educated, which is pretty different from some of the other time periods that we've looked at. But women were not really allowed to use their intelligence and their education towards anything specifically. They couldn't really take up their own jobs to earn their own money. They couldn't really inherit property unless there was some extenuating circumstances. So marriage was still the only means of financial security. So that's not too far off from some of the other periods that we've read about. Marriage was their only means of financial security and social mobility. So when you see people in those old-timey shows that are like, oh, I want to marry a good husband who is such and such rank or has this much money, this is exactly why, because women were not allowed to work on their own to even earn money for themselves. So we get a little more explanation about how that worked in this slide as well. They tell you here that women had to depend on their husbands for economic security. And this is because fathers passed on property to the closest male descendant, usually a son, but sometimes a nephew or something like that. And women could only inherit any money or property at all if there were no male heirs. So if they were all dead, or if a family was just all women. And the practice of this was known as entailment. If you were a woman and you never got married, you would just be expected to stay with your father your entire life. And maybe if they had some sort of special arrangement, you would stay with like an uncle or a family friend who was considered, as close as blood family, something like that. Women were just not allowed to have stuff on their own unless something really tragic happened to them. A marriage settlement was also common practice at this time, which basically just meant that any money or property that a woman did own at the time would belong to her and pass to her children. So they did have that in place. So if you were a woman who's like all of your male relatives died, or you managed to inherit some money because you just were the only daughter of your father, you did get to keep it. It did get to pass to your children. So no one could just like come in and take your money necessarily. But the rarity, like the percentage of that happening, it was pretty rare. Okay, so here we get a little more detail about the landed gentry and how they are in Austen's novels. So the landed gentry, that's this specific class of people, this middle and upper class, that can only inherit property through males. That's the landed gentry. And to become one of them, you had to own more than 300 acres of land. If you did not own that much land, you were not considered part of the gentry. So their jobs were to oversee the maintenance. So that's like the working of their estates, of the land that they owned. And they had a lot of administrative functions. So they basically had to keep up with all the paperwork, all the information about all of the people that were working their land, that were living there, all of those things. They had to take care of that and report it. And they had servants to help them with this too. Even within the gentry itself, there were upper and lower classes. So the social rank in that group depended on how much money you made, your income. It says here Anglican, so remember that's old-timey English. Anglican clergy also had a special position in society. So if you were an Englishman who was involved with the church, you had a special position. Any educated man could enter the profession and could earn a respectable living if attached to a wealthy parish. So this is related to the clergy. Anything, whenever you see the word clergy, you should think church. A member of the clergy is a member of a church. So in this case, it's specifically the Catholic Church, which had a big influence over England. Now, Anglican clergy had a special position in society, and any educated man, so if you went to school and graduated, could enter the profession and earn a respectable living if attached to a wealthy parish. So a parish is basically a group office, almost like a local organization for that church. So different churches or different smaller like regional churches will have their own parish in an area. So if your parish happened to own land and be wealthy, you could work for them and make a decent amount of money, is basically what this is saying. And then it says also sometimes clergy had to work as tax collectors. Now, the last paragraph says that in the novels, all of this class stuff that we've been talking about has a central role. So because her books are centered on these people and what they're doing, it's important to be able to understand this to get like the dynamics between people in terms of who's trying to marry who wants to meet who for what reason. It's all related to how this class stuff works, and that's why they're giving you the background. It says that her novels also reflect on her country's literary traditions. So by literary traditions, they mean the types of books that the country or region is famous for putting out at the time. So she was influenced by other books that came before hers and that were written in ways that were native to Britain. And it says Jane Austen was well read, and her writing displays the influence of authors such as Dr. Samuel Johnson, Samuel Richardson, and Frances Burney. So we're going to get a little more information about these authors soon enough. But I just want to point out that if Jane Austen was well read, she was very likely part of the landed gentry since she was writing about them. Okay, now we have Jane Austen's influences, and they give you a little information here about each one. So I'm not going to read through the entire thing, but we'll hit some of the more important points. So this first one here is Samuel Richardson. They tell you he's an English novelist who's credited with the development of the epistolary novel. So they're giving you the definition of what an epistolary novel is, which is a novel in which the narration is done through letters. That's right here. That should definitely be in your notes. That is an epistolary novel. So any novel where the writing is done through letters that are sent back and forth, that's called an epistolary novel. And he was the person who came up with that, or at least that we think historically came up with that. So they give you a few of his books and tell you, what his important works are. And it says here that Jane Austen was well versed in the works of Richardson. And Sir Charles Grandison, that's one of Richardson's works, was her favorite novel. So they let you know that she chose the epistolary form. So she originally wrote Pride and Prejudice as one of her most famous books as an epistolary novel. And the epistolary novel is when the letters are written back and forth. So they're telling you that her first book was written in that format, but she ended up revising it and doing something different with it. And then she published it as Pride and Prejudice. So this second author here is Samuel Johnson. His biggest thing is he was credited for writing the Dictionary of the English Language. He wrote some other things, but he's just very well known for being witty and instructive. So he's good at wit, going back and forth, and issuing instructions and advice to people about how to do things in a friendly way. And then the last author here is Fanny Burney. Now, her original name is Frances, but they call her Fanny. And she is a novelist, letter writer, playwright, and diarist. So she wrote a bunch of novels. They give you the names of them here: Evelina, Cecilia, Camilla, and The Wanderer. And all of her books feature very strong female leads. Her books are about women. They revolve around women and the issues of marriage, courtship, money, and social codes. So it wasn't exactly the same as what Jane Austen did with her books being centered on the landed gentry, but she still wrote about women and women-centered things. It just wasn't about that specific class. So Austen took a lot of inspiration from Burney and was motivated to center her books around women because of Burney's books. And then it said here at the bottom, the title Pride and Prejudice is thought to have been taken from a line in Burney's novel Cecilia. The whole of this unfortunate business has been the result of Pride and Prejudice. So they think that she took the name of her book from one of Fanny Burney's books. Okay. So here on slide 10, they give you a little more information about Jane Austen herself. They started off with a little bit of information about what was happening around the time she was born and when she grew up. But this slide gives you more information about her specifically, how she grew up. She had one sister and 6 brothers, and she wrote poetry and fiction in her teenage years. Most of these were to entertain her family because her family were very supportive about her writing. Her first draft of Pride and Prejudice was written in 1796, and it was originally called First Impressions. So that gives you a hint of what the book is actually about. But after the first draft was rejected, she revised it and got it published in 1813 under the name Pride and Prejudice. So it says Austen's first 4 novels, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Emma, and Northanger Abbey, were published anonymously. So she didn't gain much fame as a writer during her lifetime. But lots of people read her stuff now. There's lots of crossovers and movies and things like that. But she did have a devoted readership of people that did like her books. And it's known that the daughter of the Prince Regent of England actually was a very big fan of her books. It says here on slide 11, she remained single by choice, and she lived with her father and then moved to Southampton with her mother after he died. And then later on, she moved into her brother's estate and lived there until her death. So these details are just sort of important because we've learned a lot about the time period in which she lived. So just kind of knowing like, well, in this landed gentry sort of environment, where did she end up? So that's it. That's the explanation. She stayed with her father until he died, and then afterwards she stayed with her mom for a little bit, and then she moved in with her brother and died, and was buried at the Winchester Cathedral. Okay, so they do give you a bit of a longer reading. As we're getting up there, you know, you're in English 12 now, so it takes a little while to get through stuff. They give you chapters 1 through 5 of Pride and Prejudice. And this slide number 13, explains some of the themes that you're going to find in here. So it says here, Jane Austen's famous novel, Pride and Prejudice, explores the themes of love, class, marriage, pride, and prejudice. But then they go on to tell you that there's a love story in here. A man meets a woman at a social gathering, and even though they don't like each other at first, as the story goes on and they learn more about each other, they reconsider their first impressions of each other. So that's kind of where the original title, First Impressions, for this book comes into play. First impressions is what this book is about, and they change over time. If you recognize the format of this book being kind of like a romantic comedy, it's because it is. This is an older version, a written version of something like that. Two people meet, they make a terrible impression on each other, and they keep running into each other over and over again and again, and realize that their first impressions were not what they thought, you know, what they are different from what it should have been based on what they find out about each other. And they eventually decide to get together. So this is what you're, going to be reading is basically one of the oldest versions of like a rom-com in written form. And this was the entertainment that people had back in the day because, movies were not a thing. Okay. So this section here is the overview of the actual novel. And I don't want to go into this too far because it's important for you guys to actually go in and read the excerpts. If you're reading the excerpt for this or any other tutorial and you're not sure how to interpret it, you don't know if you're understanding it correctly, you can always book a tutoring session with a tutor. There's me, Ms. Amber, I'm available. And then there's also Kathy Vahovic. You can book either one of us. You can send an email to the English at ATS.edu email, or ask your advocate for the link to set up tutoring so that we can go over the reading with you. So this just goes over the opening scene really, and just explains it just in case you weren't understanding it. It's written in pretty plain English though, so hopefully it won't be too hard to understand. Now here, basically they're talking about in a little more detail what it was like when they first met each other for the first time. They both have a really bad impression of each other based on what their first interaction is. The main characters here, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, there's just issues with how they meet the first time. Their classes are different within the landed gentry, so that's a big difference. And the fact that they are proud and opinionated means that they have differing opinions on things. They basically get into an argument and debate with each other, so that doesn't go well. Now here we go over the characters. These are pretty short, so I'm just going to go over these really quickly. It's important to know what the characters are if the information is there before you start reading. For some people, that helps them understand how everyone is connected. So first we have Elizabeth Bennet. She's the second of the 5 Bennet daughters. She's intelligent, opinionated, and judgmental, and she's the principal character in the novel. So that's like a fancy way of just saying she's the protagonist or a protagonist. She's the main character. Mr. Darcy is the other main character. He's the handsome and wealthy friend of Mr. Bingley. He's an intelligent but proud man with a predisposition that means he's biased towards judging people. He does eventually fall in love with Elizabeth Bennet despite his unfavorable opinion of her at the beginning of the novel. So they eventually get together. We have Jane Bennet, which is the eldest daughter of the Bennet household. She's good natured, trusting, and has all the manners of a lady. So she's like the ideal um, lady for this time period. And she is her sister Elizabeth's closest confidant. So, closest confidant means that Elizabeth tells all her secrets to this sister. So, you're probably going to learn more about Elizabeth through what she says to her sister. Then we have Mr. Bingley. Oh, Mr. Bingley is a wealthy bachelor and the new owner of Netherfield. Even tempered and polite, he is the best friend of Mr. Darcy and falls in love with Jane Bennet. So he falls in love with Jane. And he's a wealthy bachelor. He newly moved in. So there's a whole conversation at the beginning of the book about if he's going to be interested in any of the Bennet daughters, because obviously to be taken care of and move up in society, they will want to marry somebody that has influence or money. The next character is Lydia Bennet. That is the youngest of the Bennet sisters. She's self-absorbed and immature and eventually elopes with the charming but devious Mr. Wickham. So I give you information here about things that happen in the book. They describe the sister as self-absorbed and immature, and she ends up being taken advantage of by George Wickham. He's the next character that's up, actually. Mr. Wickham is a handsome military officer who initially manages to charm Elizabeth until she learns of his true character from Mr. Darcy. Now, they're giving you hints at things that are happening in the story. So he charms Elizabeth pretty well, but Mr. Darcy tells her about his true nature. Now, because the two of them, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, don't like each other very well at first, this just feeds more into the first impressions theme of the novel. People are not always what they seem. And even though Mr. Darcy seems kind of like a jerk when they first meet, he turns out to be okay. Wickham, on the other hand, comes off as charming when they first meet, but he ends up being kind of a douche. So we have Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. These are the parents of the Bennet girls. They've been married for 23 years. Mr. Bennet is the owner of an estate. He's intelligent and well educated. And it says he makes $2,000 a year from his estate, which was a lot at the time. His sarcastic humor is evident in his conversations with his wife. Mrs. Bennet is the opposite of her husband. She's foolish and vulgar and spends most of her time thinking of how to get her daughters married into wealthy, respectable families. And then it says Mr. Bennet is a bit unrealistic about the problem that his 5 daughters face due to their inability to inherit the family estate. And Mrs. Bennet tries to solve this problem to the best of her ability. So they can't inherit the family estate. So their mother is working to try to get them married so they can be well taken care of. Their dad isn't worried about this as much. Okay, so we have Mary Bennet. That's the middle Bennet sister. She's pretty plain for the standards of the time, but she has good musical training and is well read and educated. And then it says Mrs. Bennet hopes that Mary will wed Mr. Collins after Elizabeth refuses him, but Charlotte Lucas marries him instead. We have Kitty Bennet, that's Catherine. She's the 4th daughter. She's immature and awed by the soldiers in Meryton. So they're telling you, these are the younger siblings, the 4th daughter. So they're, immature. These all are girls of varying ages. So they're written to sort of be like what young people in that age bracket would be like at the time. Let's see. We have Mr. Collins, who is a clergyman and Mr. Bennet's nephew. So because Mr. Bennet doesn't have a male heir, Mr. Collins is going to inherit the Bennet property. And that's part of the reason why they have issues with the girls needing to get married. The clergyman hopes to marry Elizabeth, but she rejects his proposal. He then proposes to Charlotte Lucas, who accepts him. Charlotte Lucas is a good friend of Elizabeth's. She's a practical person who views marriage as a means to attain financial security. And she readily accepts the marriage proposal of Mr. Collins, even though she's not in love with him. So you get a lot of different perspectives from people at this time. So there are people like Charlotte Lucas and also like Mrs. Bennet that are kind of focused on the fact that women need to be taken care of in this time period if they can't inherit money on their own. So Charlotte Lucas is like, listen, we're stuck here doing this. I can't go off and, run a business if I want. I can't make my own money. So I'm just gonna marry this guy because he likes me and he has money. But that tells you about what the concerns of women were at this time because they didn't have power to do really anything. So we have Caroline Bingley. Caroline is the younger sister of Mr. Bingley. She is conscious of her high social status, has a condescending attitude towards Elizabeth Bennet, and is spiteful. She is interested in marrying Mr. Darcy. So this tells you there's going to be sort of a rivalry going on. She's pretty mean to Elizabeth because she knows that she's of a higher social status. So her family makes more money than Elizabeth's, and she weaponizes that. And then we have Louisa Hurst. She's the married sister of Mr. Bingley. She is haughty and proud. Her views are similar to those of her sister Caroline. So if we know that Caroline is basically kind of uppity and rude because she knows that she's valuable socially, Louisa having the same views as her doesn't say good things about her. So then lastly, but not the least, we have Lady Catherine de Bourgh. That's Mr. Darcy's class-conscious aunt. She has a condescending attitude and does not approve of Mr. Darcy's desire to marry Elizabeth. She attempts to talk Elizabeth out of the marriage by pointing out Elizabeth's lower social standing. So I'm not going to expect you to to remember every single one of these. But the point of giving you the description of these characters is one, so you have a short clue to who everybody is before you read the story, or a summary in case you read the story and you're coming back to this. But also, more importantly, it's important for you to be able to recognize the different people in these stories, just in case there are any questions on the mastery test about it. I would personally take a moment to sort of write down, not necessarily every single person's paragraph here, because that's a lot of writing. But I do think that it's important to at least maybe get like a family tree of like the Bennet sisters. Like you can, use a family tree to show how they're related. And you can just add a couple notes. Mr. Darcy is the second main character of the story. And then you can list off characters that are related. It says the Bingley family also has characters that are related here. You can pretty much relate everyone in this story to either Elizabeth, Mr. Darcy, or the Bingleys. You have Elizabeth's family and her best friend. You have Mr. Darcy and his best friend, Mr. Darcy. So Mr. Darcy's best friend is Mr. Bingley. That's how they're related. And then Mr. Bingley's sisters are related as well. And then there's a couple people who are stragglers. So we have George Wickham, who runs off with one of the Bennet sisters. And then we also have Mr. Collins, who almost married one of the sisters, but ends up marrying Charlotte. So we're dealing with either the Bennets, their friends and family, or people who tried to court them, or Mr. Darcy and people who are related to him. So if you make it into a chart that's kind of like that, it'll be a little easier to keep up with it. You just want to have something that you can glance at and say, oh, okay, I forgot who this was. Well, let me just check really quick. That's kind of the sort of notes that you want here because there's so many characters. Okay, now slide 18 goes into the setting. So remember, setting is time and place. So Pride and Prejudice is set in rural England at the close of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. So the trick for centuries is to, whenever they give you a number, the blank century, you want to subtract 1 and then add 2 zeros to the end. That's how you know what year time period they're talking about. So the close of the 18th century would be the 1700s. So at the end of the 1700s, and that's pretty much the period in which she was born, Jane Austen, the period at which Jane Austen was born. She was born in 775. So this is like right at the close of that century. So 18th minus 1, 17, and then zeros at the end. So at the end of the 1700s. And then it says at the beginning of the 19th century. So minus 1, that's 18, plus 2 zeros, 1800s. So the novel opens in the Bennet home, and it involves Mr. Bennet talking to his wife about who is coming to move to the property that's near theirs. And his wife, Mrs. Bennet, talks about pretty much the fate of the girls, trying to get them married so that they can have someone to take care of them. They give you some information about the other cities that the setting is based off of. Longbourn, the estate owned by Mr. Bennet, is a fictional place developed from Austen's knowledge of the countryside in southern England, in Pemberley. Mr. Darcy estate is believed to be modeled on the Chatsworth House in Derbyshire. So the estates such as Pemberley and Netherfield act as symbols of wealth. So a lot of these places are made up, but it's obvious to the people at the time what sort of places they represent. So here we have the settings. These are the Pride and Prejudice locations. So Pride and Prejudice is set in various places in England. Some scenes occur in the city of London, while most occur in the countryside locations, such as Hertfordshire and Pemberley. So they give you a little information about London popping up in the story. There are events that take place in London, but that's outside of where most of the things happen. Most of the things happen in the countryside. So if someone's traveling or going to do something very important, that's pretty much when they go to London. Or if people are visiting anyone is like specifically to check on business or something, they are going to London. Now it says, Mr. Bingsley's sisters mentioned Cheapside, a fashionable London shopping district that they consider lower class because of who shopped there. And it became wealthy through trade rather than inheritance. Jane and Elizabeth visit their uncle and aunt, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, who own a successful business and live near Cheapside on Grace Church Street. So they're trying to make this, the point of referencing all of this and giving you this information is that Jane Austen tried to make her setting seem more realistic and believable by referencing real things in London in her story. So then we have Hertfordshire or Hertfordshire. So this is the main place that the story takes place in. It's a fictional village called Longbourn, and that's where the Bennet family lives. Longbourn is a small village in Hertfordshire. So that's a country that's north of London. I'm sorry, a county north of London. So in the early 1800s, this place was pretty much covered with wooded areas and low hills. So a lot of people had acres spread out there and they would like farm and do that sort of thing. It says Hertfordshire featured market towns similar to the fictional Meryton, small villages, and large estates like the fictional Netherfield Park purchased by Mr. Bingley. So we have Pemberley. It says here, Elizabeth travels with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner to Derbyshire, a scenic county in central England. Derbyshire is the home to the fictional Pemberley, which is a grand estate owned by Mr. Darcy. So because Mr. Darcy lives here and the story is about the two of them getting together, this is one of the settings. They give you a quote from the story that describes the land, and they basically tell you about what Elizabeth saw while she was there. But the important thing is that this is based on an actual location in the countryside. So that's why the setting is very important. Okay, so now we get into what the major themes of the story are, just overall, and how that connects to the story that they were trying to tell. So marriage is a major theme in this novel. The whole story is basically about who is marrying who, why it's beneficial, if it's fair for women to have to marry in this manner, having to recognize what it's like Being a woman during this time period and dealing with having to make decisions about who to marry and who, not to, for the sake of survival. Another theme here is the class consciousness of the gentry. So everyone is aware of how much they make, how much they have, and where they fit on the scale. And they pretty much act accordingly. Like you have the Bingley sisters who are very class conscious. They're aware of the fact that they are higher class and they kind of look down on everyone else. It's pretty awful. But everyone to a certain degree is aware of what their class is. And part of the reason why to us in this day and age it would seem ridiculous is because to us it looks like a lot of these families basically have like the same thing. Like for us, the difference between, oh, well, you own 250 acres and not 300, like for us, that sort of thing, is basically like there's no difference. But they paid attention to those small differences. If you earn just a few dollars less than someone else a month, you were technically underneath them and they didn't have to associate with you. They go into a little more detail here on this slide, just about the fact that the first title of the book was First Impressions and how that relates. I kind of went over this already, but they do it in a little more detail. They talk about the first impression that Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy make to each other. And they give you the example here. Which do you mean? And turning round, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own and coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." And then later, Elizabeth notes that Mr. Darcy's prejudice has affected her pride. "That is very true," replied Elizabeth, "and I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine." So what she's basically saying is they both made hasty judgments about each other. She just assumed that Mr. Darcy just assumed that Elizabeth was just like most of the other girls that are her age. And from overhearing a conversation she had with someone else, just had the wrong impression about her character. So he was very cold and insulted her, and her feelings were hurt. Her pride was hurt as a person. So she just kind of refused to believe that he could be anything other than an awful person. And this is how the novel starts. Now, when you read chapters 1 through 5, you'll actually get to see up close the sort of interactions that these characters have with other people in the story and how that changes things over time when they run into each other and things like that. But as for the very beginning, this is pretty much how it starts. And that's how it feeds into, even outside of the first title of First Impressions, pride and prejudice. Those are two big themes in this book as well, because people's pride being hurt leads to them being prejudiced against judging other people. And that's the entire point of the book. Okay. So here they go over basically the pride portion of this. Many characters in this book exhibit excessive pride. Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth can't see each other's true character. They can't see each other's true personality through the way that their pride colors their views. So what they're saying is when you view everything from the viewpoint of being prideful yourself, and you're not able to step outside of yourself to see like, well, why did I make this impression on somebody? What did I do, or how did this look to someone else? And you just sort of judge someone based on how they might have judged you. That's how you get into this sort of cycle. Mr. Darcy's pride stems from his lineage. He doesn't think much of people who belong to the lower ranks of society. So he's from the Pemberley estate. He's worth a lot. And he just sort of assumes a lot of things about people who are in classes underneath his, even though she's still part of the landed gentry. Her father still makes a decent amount of money, but not as much. And he just assumes awful things about how people who are beneath him work. And it's not until much later on in the book when he realizes that Elizabeth has traits that he really likes, because he doesn't really want like an airheaded girl to marry him just for his money either. It's not until way later in the book when they run into each other that he has a change of heart and realizes that if he wasn't so biased, he could have seen or read into the intelligence in her words when he met her the very first time. So now we're moving into literary devices. So those creative things that, give our stories punch. So there's just only a couple things. There's third person narration. So just a reminder of that. If you haven't seen that in a while, third person narration is when you are reading a story or viewing a story from an outside perspective. So when you are looking at a story from the outside, you're not being told a story by the person experiencing it. So the characters aren't saying I. And the story is not about you. So the book isn't saying, well, you open the door, you feel this way, you run to the nearest exit. The only thing left is third person. So third person is when, like I said, you're telling a story from outside of yourself. You're saying, well, these two people, they went to go do this. He said this. She felt like this. That's third person. Now, outside of that, there are two types of third person narration. The two types, if you remember from older English classes, are third person limited, which is where it's he or she, but you're focused on just one person. And there's omniscient, which is when you know everyone's thoughts and feelings. There's kind of sort of another type that's in between there, but it's not as important. The two that you want to remember are limited. So that's when you're focused on one or just a couple characters. And omniscient is when you know the thoughts and feelings of every single person in the story. Here, we just have third person narration. We get like a little bit of omniscience in here. We get to know a little bit of what the other characters are thinking and feeling whenever it's important. And it's mixed with something called free indirect speech. Now, free indirect speech is when there's a distinction between the narrator's voice and the character's thoughts being blurred together. So normally you can tell the difference between the voice that's telling the story. You get that whole, well, once upon a time, Cinderella, like sort of thing. But in free indirect speech, the narration, the story is written as though it's in the voice of the character who's in the story. So they give you an example of this. The free indirect speech is at the bottom. We have, her coming there was a most unfortunate, the most ill-judged thing in the world. How strange it must appear to him, and what a disgraceful light might it not strike so vain a man. It might seem as if she had purposefully thrown herself this way again. Oh, why did she come? Or why did he thus come a day before he was expected? So it's telling you what's happening. This guy came a day early, and she's concerned about what it looks like. Elizabeth is concerned about what it looks like. She thinks that this was unfortunate, the most ill-judged thing in the world. But what you need to realize when you're reading this is that that's biased, though. If we had a voice just telling us what happened, we wouldn't get these feelings mixed in. We would just find out that what she thinks is that it's unfortunate. We will find out that she feels is the most ill-judged thing. But the narration, the storytelling, says Elizabeth's feelings as though it's actual fact in the story. So you don't really know if she's telling the story or not. The narration says he, she, like it's someone outside of her, but it's also representing her actual point of view in the narration. So that's what free indirect speech is, when the storytelling gets blurred with the character's thoughts and actions. Okay, let me see. No, okay. Alrighty. So they tell you on slide 26 a little more about what having free indirect speech in the story does. It allows Austen to put irony into her narration. So remember, irony is when you say one thing but mean another. When it's raining outside and you're like, oh, this is the best thing in the world. It's not the same as sarcasm. I have students that get these things confused all the time. The difference between irony and sarcasm is that sarcasm is irony said with the point of insulting someone. That's the only difference. So if you are saying the opposite of what you mean to insult someone, like if you see someone that knows that you don't think they're attractive and you're like, oh yeah, she's a regular supermodel, that's sarcasm because you tried to hurt their feelings. Irony is just when you say one thing but mean another. It's not always to insult someone. So if you need to write that down in your notes, which you might, go ahead and actually put that down. Now, Austen uses just irony. It's not sarcasm, just irony. She uses it to add humor to her novels because she's able to basically express feelings towards social norms at the time, pointing out how contradictory they can be. It says, for example, characters often make ironic statements without knowing it. And that's what stops it from being sarcasm. They are not being ironic on purpose to hurt anyone's feelings. They're just saying what they know is true as people in this story, and it happens to be ironic. So, for example, they quote the opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice is, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." The reason why this is ironic is because it's basically teasing Elizabeth's mom's way of thinking. Mrs. Bennet really does think that a single man in possession of a good fortune has to want a wife, but she has to hope that because she has 5 daughters that need to be married and taken care of. She wants men with good fortunes to marry her daughters. But the reality of it is that her daughters are the ones who need people to marry them. If you are single and you have money, you don't need anything, right? You can take care of yourself. But Mrs. Bennet saying he must be in want of a wife. That's ironic because no, actually he doesn't. But what you need is for them to want a wife so that you can get rid of your daughters, so that you don't have to worry about who's going to take care of them. So that's the irony there. She says that someone with money and fortune has to be in want of a wife. But what she means is that her daughters need people with money to marry them. So she's saying one thing, but the truth and the meaning is the opposite. Now here on this slide 27, they talk about situational irony, which is just when the outcome of an action is the opposite of what you would expect. That's it. It's the same definition as irony when you say something or write something. It just has to do with what happens. A situation is something that has to physically happen, right? So irony is when that situation ends up in a way that's different than what you would expect. That's it. So they give you an example of this. It's an example from chapter 6, but really quickly. Mr. Darcy is being encouraged to choose a dance partner. And what he says is, "Certainly, sir, and it has the advantage of also being in vogue amongst the less polished societies of the world. Every savage can dance." So he assumes that everyone can dance and that it benefits the lower ranks to be able to dance because then they get to dance with people who are wealthy. But he asks Elizabeth to dance, and she's like, "No, I don't want to dance with you." So he assumes everyone can dance, and more importantly, what he's implying is that anyone who can dance would want to dance with him because of his class. But he asks Elizabeth, and she's like, "No, no, thanks." So it doesn't actually end up the way that he would expect. If everyone can dance, she should say yes, right? But she didn't. So we've got like 2 tones of irony here. Not only should everyone be able to dance, and she's like, "No, I don't want to dance," but also he's expecting everyone that can dance to say yes to him, and she does not say yes. So here on this slide, 29, they talk about witty conversations. So in this story, a lot of the information you learn about people and what they think and how they feel about things happens in private conversations. So there's a lot of dialogue, conversations going back and forth with these characters. So, for example, they say Mrs. Bennet's conversations often reflect her foolishness. So, this is just in line with the same quote we had from her before about any man being in want, every man with wealth and fortune being in want of a wife, even though that's the opposite of what's happening. So, she reveals her viewpoints like that in conversation. So Austen uses this as a tool so that you can actually get to know the characters behind closed doors. You're not just reading about their interactions. Oh, such and such wants to marry who. You actually get information as to how they view society and the stuff that they have to do based on what's best for them and how they view other people through the small conversations that she has in the novel. And that's good character development. If you just tell someone, oh, this person is bad, oh, this person is good, we're not believing that. We have to actually see the picture of how they treat people. Okay, and I think that that's most of the lesson. Yep, it sure is. That's actually it. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing. Basically, when it comes to Pride and Prejudice, it's just important to remember the time period that everybody operated in. And if you're having any issues with understanding what's going on in the story so far as the irony or the wittiness or anything like that, I encourage you to read the excerpt. You're reading chapters 1 through 5 in the first part and a little bit more after. And if you're still having issues with understanding something, make sure that you take notes on what sections you're having a hard time understanding. Then what you can do is schedule a session with a tutor. So that would be me or Miss Kathy Vahovic. And we can help you with the sections that you don't understand and try to connect it to the lesson. But they pretty much gave you everything that you needed to know right there. You've got the plot of the story, you know how things are going to end up. You've got the history of the landed gentry and how and why people behave the way they do. You got a rundown of the characters, so you know that some of them are class conscious and hold their class status over people's heads. Some people are just sick of the whole system. Some people are very prideful. You have Elizabeth and Darcy. You've got the Bennet parents who just want to see their daughters married off and safe. And that's pretty much it. Everything else is just kind of watching the story unfold with detail as you read. So that's about it for this lesson. Don't forget, if you have any quick questions, you can join the help desk. The help desk is the open desk that we have for students to come in and ask questions. It's open from 11 to 3 p.m. So 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. And if you miss help desk, you can always come into these live lessons. We do them live, but we'll stop our lessons to answer any questions you guys might have about any specific lesson. And outside of that, you can schedule a tutoring session with a tutor. But I think that's about it. So this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English class.